Hi, everyone. Let's get started. I hope you were all able to get lunch. I'm Liz Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, along with Dan Kamstrom, Faculty Director, and Abby Kinkel, our wonderful Administrative Assistant. Welcome to today's program, Undoing Past Policies, Building Equitable Access to Affordable Homeownership. As many of you know, for the past few years, we've brought dynamic and cutting-edge lawyers to DC as Rappaport Senior Fellows to share their work and their enthusiasm for different areas of law that showcase the intersection of law and policy. Today, to kick off a special week, Property and Housing Law Week at DC, we're delighted to welcome yet another dynamic and cutting-edge lawyer, Danielle Kinkel, as our Senior Fellow. Danielle is General Counsel of Massachusetts Housing Partnership, a nonprofit quasi-state agency that creates and preserves affordable housing. Danielle is a longtime housing lawyer before joining MHP to work for many years at the law firm Nolan, Fee and Patton, working on zoning and permitting, housing subsidies, statutes and regulations, tax credit structures and compliance, and more. She's also active in the housing-related organizations, including the Boston Bar Association's Affordable Housing Committee, the Young Professionals Group of Citizens Housing and Planning Association, better known as CHAPA, the American Bar Association's Forum on Affordable Housing and Community Development, and she served as co-chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee of CREW, the Commercial Real Estate Women of Boston. Danielle is also engaged in community service through her pro bono representation of 3L Place, a nonprofit dedicated to providing educational opportunities and ongoing support for adults with autism, Lawyers Clearinghouse, and helping victims of Hurricane Katrina. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan with degrees in history and philosophy. She has a master's degree in education policy from here at Boston College, and she has a law degree from Northeastern. If you would like to meet with Danielle, she's holding office hours later today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. Affordable housing is an issue that has deep historical roots and contemporary challenges. It's probably safe to say, that the topic affects virtually all of us in this room and far beyond. In thinking about our focus for the week, we decided to hone in on home ownership with an eye towards equity. According to CHAPA, as published recently in the Boston Globe, in Massachusetts, we're building about 17,000 new homes a year, half of what was built in the 1980s. And we have a shortage of at least 108,000 homes. Today's program starts the conversation of how do we resolve such a seemingly intractable problem. We continue tomorrow with Professor Lisa Alexander's class, to which everyone is invited. Starts at 9:45 in the morning, I believe. On Wednesday, we continue with the Rappaport Center's program entitled Affordable Homeownership, Barriers and Solutions. Big word there, solutions. And the week ends on Friday with Professor Thomas Mitchell's conference on land loss, reparations, and housing policy. Please note that for our program on Wednesday, my biggest pitch, say for this, we'll be delving into specific issues of homeownership, supply and demand, programs available to first-time home buyers, the new MBTA community zoning law, and so much more. We have an amazing panel of affordable housing experts, including the CEO of Urban Edge, the president of DBM Consulting, Mass Housing's product and lending analytics manager, and Professor Alexander. Lunch is being provided by Emma's Taqueria, which according to today's impact blog by Travis Salters and Tess Halpern is second best. Maybe in the fall, we'll try for Teresa's Market, which they deemed the best. It's now my pleasure to introduce and welcome Danielle Kinkel, and this program is being recorded.
Thank you, Lissy. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for participating, grabbing your free lunch. I get it. I'm excited, so excited to be here talking with all of you, and hopefully my presentation will go because it's going to be pretty boring without the slides. There you go. I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you, Lissy, for the opportunity to be your senior fellow in residence this week. Okay. I'll just get started. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. Office hours. I'm happy to talk about anything law school or public policy related. I can talk about my career and obviously talk about affordable housing, any other topics that you'd like. But we'll get underway. And today we're talking about undoing past policies, past housing policies, and building equitable access to affordable homeownership. Pause 1 second.
Abby, are you trying to make it bigger?
Yeah, I just.
Or we might have. Oh,
It always, you know, something. I guess I'll get started, right? Hopefully, there are a lot of, as you can already see, there are a lot of other exciting and dynamic ideas to present here. But Lissy just reviewed my whole first 3 slides or so about who I am and why I'm here. But as she mentioned, I'm the general counsel at MHP. MHP is a quasi-public state agency. We provide financing and technical advice to the affordable housing community. That includes to first-time home buyers and to the real estate development community, those developers who provide affordable housing in the Commonwealth. There's a lot more to all of us than our credentials, but I was going to mention mine because I'm a BC alumni, and I thought it's always just fun to add that. I went to the University of Michigan, and then I came to BC to get a master's in education. And a little fun fact is that when I was pulling in here today, this is the exact same place that I stopped at my very first stop when I came to Boston. So about 20 years later, I'm coming full circle. Then I went to Northeastern Law, and there I did a summer associateship and then became an associate at DLA Piper, eventually leading to join a group of partners who formed that boutique law firm, Nolan, Sheehan, Patton. I was there for almost a decade and became partner there before leaving to be general counsel at MHP. So with all of that, so that's that part. So with all that out of the way, why did Lissy reach out to me, right? Is this like easier? Should I do anything? So why did Lissy reach out to me? She just ran through a ton of reasons why housing is a hot topic. It's hard to read the news or even check social media without reading about it. If you've even noticed, or if any of you read the Globe, it was the front cover on the Sunday Globe, or I don't know, maybe like the last 3 or 4 weeks out of the last couple months. Here, Professor Mitchell starting the new initiative on land, housing, and property rights, and your own very own resident housing expert, Professor Alexander. But as you know, we're not just talking about any kind of housing, right? We're talking about affordable housing. We all want to know about housing that's reasonably priced, housing that people can really afford. It's affordable housing for everyone, right? Interest rates are rising. Home prices skyrocketing, and not just in urban cores. Now they're skyrocketing in all cities and towns at alarming rates. Estimates are showing that the home prices have increased 40% since the start of the pandemic. And even sellers, particularly elder sellers and homeowners, can't find or afford places to move to, which puts another strain on the housing market. Oh, yay! Hooray! Great! Thank you, thank you. Here, we'll rip through these. Yay, great, that, good, great, we're back. All right, putting even another strain on the housing market. And Lizzie was just talking to me about this issue before we got here. So there you see. But it's not just reasonably priced housing, it's our economy, it's the future. Record numbers of Massachusetts residents are leaving the Commonwealth for areas with cheaper costs of living, cheaper home prices. Massachusetts lost 110,000 residents since the start of the pandemic. After years and years of population growth, year over year, we've had population loss for the last 3 years running. So we're all thinking about this. All of you are thinking about this. Where are you going to take a job? Where are you going to move when you graduate? We're thinking about it all the time. This new kind of affordability brain drain threatens our economy. It threatens who we can hire, who's going to teach our kids, and frankly, who's going to contribute to the tax base. So affordability is an issue for government and business leaders and for all of you as our future policymakers, right? It's no surprise that the Rappaport Center wanted to spend some time talking about affordable housing. So we're going to talk about housing, not all kinds of housing. We don't have time for that. Lizzie said that I could pick any topic that I wanted as long as it was kind of related to affordable housing, which is great. But then I thought to myself, well, what am I going to talk about? I want to talk about something that really interests me, something that I confront every day as a policymaker, and something that I think is just plain important to talk about, and that's equitable access to homeownership. We're going to spend a little time talking about what affordable housing is, what affordable homeownership is, and how that's just one small element of the greater housing puzzle. We're going to talk about past housing policies, how they affected communities of color, particularly Black Americans, and inequitable access to homeownership. Inequitable access is an affordability issue as much as interest rates, as much as home prices, stagnant wages, and financial literacy. It has to be addressed by current and future policymakers. Then we'll finish by wrapping up with ideas and initiatives that we're thinking about here in Massachusetts and throughout the country to address the racial homeownership gap and the importance of advocating for race-based programs and some of the headwinds we're facing in our efforts to undo discriminatory policies and build equitable access. And just a little bit of housekeeping, even though Lizzie already did all of this, we have Professor Alexander's lecture, we have a panel on Wednesday, I have office hours, and of course, this brand new conference towards the end of the week, which I'm really excited to attend, land loss reparations and housing policy. All right, guys, we got the slides ready. We got all of that out of the way. Let's get going. I've been doing a lot of talking. I want to hear from you. I've never had this position in a law school, so I'm going to ask a little bit of questions. You might be wondering what's affordable housing. So does anyone want to take a wild guess about like, what does that mean? What do you think affordable housing is? You can do it. Anything? Any idea of what might resonate to you as affordable housing? This is tough, guys, professors. Here you go. What? Right there, yeah.
Housing to pay rent on time and with the minimum wage.
Oh, wow, that is a really, I'm gonna put a pin in that, with the minimum wage job. That is, as you will see, and as we could talk about, really nearly impossible. So, all right, affordable housing, as we typically understand it. And the general term when people say affordable housing in this world is that it's no more than 30% of that household's existing income will go towards housing. Anything more than that, we call cost burden, house burden. So the term affordable housing, and when I say affordable housing industry, I'm specifically referring to households, to housing that's not built by the traditional housing market. Talking about apartments and homes for households making very low to moderate incomes and who can't afford to pay market rents, especially in high cost neighborhoods, but increasingly in low cost neighborhoods too. So landlords and owners, you know, they're interested in being profit motivated, and that makes a ton of sense. These are investment properties for them. So that's fine. They're interested in charging higher rents and raising rents over time. Okay. There's no market or incentive to produce or own properties that are sold for less than the cost to build them. There's no market or incentive to rent an apartment for less than the cost of operating it. So beginning in the late 1800s and all the way through today, government plays a role in filling this gap, either by building the housing itself through public housing authorities or by providing incentives and subsidies to private developers who then agree to accept below market rents or below market sale prices. So affordable housing refers to that, when the government in whole or in part financially supports residents and developers to pay about 30% of their income on rent. But all this is part of a much broader housing system. There are several sectors and different kinds of housing, and I'm not familiar with all of them and can't really speak about many of them intelligently. But just remember that affordable housing is usually talking about affordable rental housing, and today we're talking about affordable homeownership. All right, here's a spoiler alert. There's no big answer. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic answer at the end of this presentation that's going to solve all homeownership issues, right? Housing is difficult, it's complicated, and there are a lot of policy levers that we need to do. We have to address them at all levels of government. But today, for this, in 45 minutes left, we're going to talk about access to homeownership. Okay, so affordable homeownership. Let's try this one. All right, anything? How many of you are homeowners? How many in the room? Homeowners? Huh? Mm-hmm. How many of you aspire to be a homeowner one day? Yeah. Homeownership is a part of the American dream. It is a part of America, like apple pie, baseball, own your home. It's not for everyone, but it is our primary way of generating wealth in this country. But I think the reality for a lot of homeowners, and again, Lizzie and I were talking about this today, and it's true for me and my husband too, is that we couldn't buy our home again at today's prices, okay? I could not buy my condo again today. What may have once been affordable is now completely unrealistic, okay? In the home buying context, we allow for a higher percentage of income to be considered affordable, like around 38 to 40% of income. We would consider that an affordable home buying situation, okay? That can include your mortgage payments, insurance payments, condo costs, all the fun stuff that you get once you become a homeowner, okay? But the opportunities to buy a home and keep it at about 40% of your income, they're dwindling by the day, and definitely not for lower income families and middle to upper income folks who could traditionally access the homeownership market, even just as, years ago. We don't have as many entry-level homes, entry-level being like around 1,400 square feet. That market has collapsed. In the 1970s, 34% of homes built were entry-level homes. That figure has been dropped down to 7% of all homes in 2019 would be considered entry-level homes. There's nowhere for you to start your home ownership journey. The supply is an issue. So stakeholders are increasingly more interested in how to incentivize and support the traditional home building market so that it builds more affordably priced homes, but also how to support lower and moderate income households directly. So basically you have to look at it from the supply side and the demand side. So when I use affordable home ownership, I'm talking about when your government provides subsidy to help the development and sale of affordable homes to households of lower income levels, and not just luxury condos and luxury single family homes. All right. So we're going to be talking about access and how you build equitable access to homeownership. Now, if we somehow manage to build a huge number of homes to meet the demand, but certain households and communities couldn't access them, we would still have an affordability issue. Similarly, if somehow overnight we were able to solve the equity crisis and everyone had access but couldn't figure out the supply side, we would still have an affordability issue. These issues are intertwined. One is as important as the other. So equitable access is as much an issue as interest rates, down payment, local zoning hurdles. It's all connected. All right. So we're going to spend a little time learning about how the market became inequitable. Simply said, non-white households have been systematically withheld from home ownership opportunities throughout the 20th century. Federal housing policies created and encouraged home ownership opportunities for white households. And this reality, along with a ton of other factors, do not get me wrong, has led to a complete and entrenched imbalance of intergenerational wealth and opportunity for Black and Brown communities in the United States. All right, we're going to take a couple minutes learning how we got here. So, okay. So to be honest with you, I don't have the expertise, others in the room do, and clearly not the time to provide a full overview of US housing policy. But suffice to say, starting with the Homestead Act during the Civil War, there have been hundreds, thousands of policies at the federal, state, and local levels to address different aspects of housing. So we're going to keep this brief. We're going to keep it high level. So policies, as you all know, are basically deliberate actions, programs, practices that are intended to produce specific outcomes. That's the whole idea. That's what we're trying to do. We're going to go over a couple examples of historic housing policies. Okay, so we have the Homeownership Loan Corporation that was established in 1933 by the federal government in the wake of the Great Depression. It was created for the specific purpose of identifying secure areas that were ripe for investment and also to help homeowners avoid foreclosure after the Great Depression. Okay, it also established the idea of 30-year fixed rate, 15 and 30-year fixed rate mortgages. That's what we understand. That's what you do now. But that didn't happen before the 1930s. Before the 1930s, if you wanted to buy a home, you had to have 50% of the down payment, and you might be able to get a loan from a local bank, 3 or 5 year loan. So basically, anyone who was a homeowner before these policies started, they already had a lot of money. Then we have the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, that was created in 1934. This was created for the specific purpose of developing and providing mortgage insurance for those low-cost, fixed-rate, long-term loans that I just talked about. Great. Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill. Okay, that was created for the specific purpose of helping to provide benefits for World War II vets. Great. The National Interstate Defense and Highways Act of 1956, created for the purpose of building a highway system. It's all pretty simple, right? So here we have a basic concept. Deliberate actions for specific outcomes. But what we need to remember, and what all of you as future policymakers need to understand and pay attention to, is that there's a missing and often unspoken piece of the puzzle here. That these deliberate actions were intended to produce specific outcomes, of course, but only for specific people and only for specific groups of people. These policies were intended to have different outcomes for different individuals and groups. For example, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was meant to prevent foreclosure and determine what areas were secure for investment. But the program only graded white areas as secure. This resulted in lending and investment to predominantly white communities, and also expressly withheld resources from Black communities. The Homeownership Loan Corporation policies paved the way for institutionalized redlining for decades and decades, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The FHA provided home mortgage insurance, and it certainly did, but only in white neighborhoods. And as a policy, the FHA required that the homes were being insured in communities where they could almost make sure of and guarantee there was no chance of integration between white households and households of color. Saying that differently, segregation was a requirement for FHA mortgage insurance. The GI Bill, created to support vets, but the benefits were denied to 1.2 million Black veterans. In theory, the vets could apply for and receive the same loans, but the law didn't provide those loans. The Black veterans still had to go to the traditional housing market, and as you can see, that wasn't really open for business for them. Then the National Highways Act. That was enacted to build the interstate highway system and connect newly suburban residents into the city core, the economic centers, and to connect the growing footprint of the nation. But the law also resulted in a wide-scale demolition of Black communities throughout the US. These major highways needed major amounts of physical space and in the urban core, and most often African-American neighborhoods were targeted for these projects in the name of blight and urban renewal. No transitional or substitute housing was ever provided. While Black Americans represented only 10% of the population in 1961, they comprised at least 66% of those displaced. So, to be clear, these policies, they were a great success in many, many ways. They provided home ownership opportunities for many, and they created a middle class. They helped well-deserving veterans return home successfully. They connected communities and the entire country to one another. There's no debating the successes. But there's another truth, right? that these policies were systemically and intentionally unfair and discriminatory. And sure, we all know about racism, okay? We know about institutional racism. We know how things were. But that was a really long time ago, right? Why does that even matter now? Those policies were decades ago and discrimination's illegal, right? And that's true. But the Black homeownership rate in the US today is the same as almost 100 years ago, before the Fair Housing Act, and before anti-discrimination laws. Our country is more segregated today than it was 100 years ago. We haven't made progress on these issues, okay? Homeownership rates among BIPOC households lag behind white households at alarming rates. There are many reasons why this and solutions will necessarily take time. Choices on where you live, and even the choice to buy a home is on its own a very long-term decision. These things can't simply be reversed. You can't eliminate residential segregation by changing the sign at the door or at the front of the bus. You can't require people to move out of neighborhoods, and you can't require them to move into neighborhoods. The whole situation is systemic, and it requires significant long-term intervention at every level of government. All right, let's take a beat. That was a lot. All right, that was my lecture-y part of this whole thing. All right, I promise. All right. Now, it's fun to do laws, regulations, all the technical jargon. You're all students, a lot of you are students. That's fun. But for me, it's the stories that really help things pop off the page. It's the stories that help things click, okay? So when I was preparing for this, I was kind of thinking about, well, what story do I want to tell? Whose story do I want to tell? What do I talk about? And then I just thought, well, why don't I tell my story? My light bulb story. The moment when my brain light bulb went off and all of this clicked into place for me. Maybe that'll help you think about your own housing story. We all have one. We all have a housing situation. So indulge me, we're going to take a little trip down my memory lane. So remember, I went to the University of Michigan, but I also grew up in Michigan, okay? I lived there until I moved here to Boston. All right, during one of my American history courses, and I was an American history major, we were studying this book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit, right? Okay, so my professor was starting to give a lecture on the concept of racial restrictive covenants. We're gonna pause for a pop quiz. Does anyone know what a restrictive covenant is from Professor Mitchell's property law class? Anybody? Huh? There are different kinds of covenants, and there are restrictive ones. Okay, in the back.
As a student of Professor Mitchell,
Mhm.
which there are two of us, just the background, it places some form of restriction on a piece of property. In terms of either its use.
Yep.
Or how do we occupy.
There you go. You can stop there. That's great. Well done. Well done. Restrictive covenants. Very good. Well done. Restrictive covenants. They're agreements or promises made into the deed, typically to restrict property for the enjoyment, value, and use of adjoining properties. Okay. Right. Well done. Points for you. So my professor is explaining restrictive covenants and racial restrictive covenants. Okay. And then all of a sudden he starts talking about my hometown, Grosse Pointe, Michigan. All right. So my ears perk up. Grosse Pointe is a suburban community located right next door to Detroit. It's mid-sized, about 50,000 people, and that stayed steady since about the 1950s. Detroit, for those of you who don't know, it's in southeastern Michigan, and that's the mitten. It's up there. And Grosse Pointe is right there immediately to the northeast of Detroit. This whole area here, this is Detroit. All right. So this is the deed to our house when my parents bought it in 1979. The previous owners bought it directly from the builder in the 1950s. And a fun fact, maybe for those who are interested in tiny houses, my house was a Montgomery Ward kit house, and kit houses were Montgomery Ward, Sears, Better Homes and Gardens. They would, we could go down a whole rabbit hole on this, but it's basically prefabricated materials elsewhere, and then those are shipped to the home builder so that they can build tracts of homes quickly, efficiently, and right away to build the suburbs. So we actually do know how to build homes quickly, efficiently, and a lot of them at once, if we have land, but that's another thing. Okay, so as my professor was pointing out, and little did I know, Grosse Pointe was widely known for its rampant use of redlining and restrictive covenants. I'm the daughter of a German-Irish white guy and a Filipina immigrant, okay? I was extremely aware that I was mixed race growing up in Grosse Pointe. I was very aware that I wasn't totally white and that almost everyone else was. I was also aware that there were very few, if any, Black families in Grosse Pointe. Turns out only 0.1% of Grosse Pointe was made up of Black families according to the 1980 census. So pretty white community. I just thought that all the Black families lived in Detroit. I didn't think very much about it until that lecture. I had no idea that these qualities of my hometown were the result of very intentional and discriminatory policies. This is the FHA underwriting manual from 1936. This policy required that valuators, who are the people who go out and check out a home to see whether or not it's suitable for mortgage insurance or a loan, the valuators, this is the policy that they were used to identify whether or not compatible racial groups were present. If the area was to stay stable, basically, if it was to stay a good investment, the homes had to be occupied by members of the same race and class. Meaning the FHA wanted the valuators to confirm that the areas were segregated, always in the name of property values and neighborhood stability. This, on the other side, is the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map, residential security map for Detroit in 1939. Okay, as the term redlining implies, the red areas are hazardous. Okay, the red areas are hazardous. Yellow areas are in decline because African American families were moving into those communities. Blue areas still desirable, still mostly white. Green areas are the best, right for investment. As you can see, Grosse Pointe up there, green, 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 ready to go. But right across the border in Detroit, so now you have some yellow. And here you have some categories of what red versus yellow would mean. So the yellow status meant that there was no immediate danger of encroachment, but a heavy concentration was nearby. So in no uncertain terms, that meant that no loans or investments could be made in those areas, which resulted in a lack of resources for these areas and these neighborhoods. And it became difficult for anyone, white or Black, to get loans and investments to buy in these areas. So westward, you'll see several areas of red, which were the historically African-American neighborhoods of Detroit, and all the surrounding areas are yellow. They are declining. So as you can see, already in 1939, we have a plan literally mapping out disinvestment in the entire city of Detroit, while highlighting other areas for specific and intentional investment. So as ugly as they are, I thought it was important just to show some of the real and direct examples of racial covenants from the Metro Detroit area, okay? So as you can see, right there, right in the deed, no persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any premises or any part thereof in said subdivision, except that this provision shall not prevent occupancy or of domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. Had to make a carve out, right? Pretty much the same thing here. Members of the Caucasian race only, carve out for domestic servants. Again, no person of any race other than a member of the Caucasian race, et cetera, other than domestic servants. So, not great, but it gets worse. As I was researching for this, I uncovered the Grosse Pointe point system. This was used from 1945 to 1960, so that includes the time when the original owners of the house bought my childhood home in 1955. So racial covenants, restrictive covenants, they were found unconstitutional in 1948 through the landmark case Shelley v. Kramer, where a 6-0 court held that these racial covenants denied African Americans equal protection of the law and violated their civil rights. Okay, but that only meant they were unenforceable. People still kept putting them in. They eventually became illegal in 1968, but after 1948, they were still there. They still put them in, they just weren't enforceable. So communities, property associations, different groups found other ways to sort of make sure that integration would never happen. Sort of to make sure that even if the racial covenants couldn't be enforced, they could still have a mostly white community. So here we are. A point system was used in Grosse Pointe, quite literally a gross point system. That was a pun, that was a well-intended pun, but that's not the why the town was named that, but it's a gross point system. All right, that's a screening system for potential home buyers and builders. This was set up by the local property owners association and the local real estate brokers association. Okay. A prospective buyer could earn up to 100 points, and families of particular races and ethnicities had to get a higher level of points to even be considered. Okay, just gonna pause and tell you, I don't like repeating all of this. They're not my words. They aren't my actions, but it's still really painful to repeat some of these words, okay? Here are some sample questions. Appearances. Is the household swarthy, slightly swarthy, or not at all? Now I had to Google swarthy. It means dark skinned. Accents. Pronounced, medium, slight, or none at all. Dress. Neat, sloppy, flashy, conservative. Grammar. About it. Good, fair, poor. White home buyers could pass with 50 points. Households of Polish ancestry had to score at least 55. Greeks, 65, Italians, 75, and Jewish families had to get 85. No ratings were permitted or allowed for Orientals or Negroes. So my family wouldn't have been able to buy there. My family wasn't welcome. And this was eye-opening and pretty painful for me to discover recently. So policies like these perpetuated segregation well after separate but equal was dispelled. These policies created an abundance of available credit for white communities and households and suppressed and oppressed non-white households. As the civil rights movement got underway in the 1960s, this concept became known as the other America, okay? You can see that the same block here in Eastern Detroit in 1951 and in 2010. The disinvestment is real. The deterioration is physical and significant. Most interesting from maybe an academic sense, perhaps, is how stark and visible the two Americas are in Detroit and Grosse Pointe. Alter Road is the well-known street delineating Grosse Pointe from Detroit, as these two towns are right next to each other. The demarcation between the two Americas was so apparent and appalling along Alter Road that even in the 1960s, Martin Luther King visited Grosse Pointe in 1968, only 3 weeks before he was assassinated, to deliver a speech called The Other America. He called out these injustices and described how they were a result of intentional and deliberate choices by people, by legislators, by community leaders, by the federal and state governments. These two Americas were not the result of individual choices and situations. They're the result of entrenched systems. Growing up, I didn't know anything about this speech. I didn't know anything about Martin Luther King's visit. That commemorative plaque was only recently placed in 2021. So again, you might be asking, why are we talking about this old stuff, okay? Why are we talking about the fact that my family wouldn't have bought our home in 1955? We bought it in 1979. What's the big deal, right? Well, it's important because the impacts last for generations. The impacts of the deliberate actions and the specific outcomes are long-standing. Here's a Google Earth shot, 2010 of Grosse Pointe. Alter Road is the left side of this photo. Here's a Google Earth shot, same day, 2010 of Detroit. Alter Road running right down the middle. Yards away from each other. 1 block west of Alter Road in Detroit, the median home price, $51,000. Public schools are the second worst in the state, and almost all residents are renters, okay? One block over in Grosse Pointe, literally a couple hundred yards away, as you just saw. Homes are 314,000. Kids can go to exceptional schools ranked 93rd out of 100. And almost everyone's a homeowner. You can't point to distance, geography, or really even individual choices for these differences. I'm not even aware of another place where the disparity is so blatant for properties located so close to one another. So the light bulb went off for me that day, right? Never forgot it. It's what got me thinking about public policy. It's what got me thinking about what I wanted to do when I grew up. It's pretty much the day that got me started on the journey to where I am today. But this isn't unique to Grosse Pointe, okay? Quite the opposite. This is the story that's commonplace to every state and nearly every city in America. The inequities persist here in Massachusetts, of course. The 2022 Greater Boston Housing Report Card found that the racial homeownership gap here is 46th in the nation. Nearly 70% of white households are homeowners, while only 35% and 31% respectively of Black and Latinx households are homeowners. More troubling to me are some of the numbers at the lower income, because you might think lower income, lower homeownership, right? But even at that level, white households are still doing pretty well. Still, homeowners at pretty high rates, but families of color, they drop off pretty precipitously. So without home equity to tap into, non-white small business owners have fewer opportunities to grow and expand, fewer opportunities to weather financial storms. Non-white families are also less able to shoulder the financial burden of higher education for themselves and their children. Non-white families are more likely then to incur high interest private educational loans and then become debt burdened further and further it goes. Massachusetts still remains highly segregated. You see most white households live in the suburban areas, either it's metro or further out. Sometimes it's in mature suburbs, sometimes it's just newly developing suburbs. While the communities of color, decades later, remain in the metro core and regional urban centers. So these racial disparities in housing lead to unbelievable imbalances in wealth, generating opportunities. And whether you like it or not, homeownership is pretty much the primary way to build wealth in this country. We can talk about that, we can debate it, whether that's good or bad, that's for another time. In today's world, access to homeownership directly translates to access to wealth. A 2015 report conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and if you haven't seen this statistic already, you know, this one's out there, but they found that white households in Greater Boston have an average net worth of $247,000, while non-immigrant Black households have $8. Yeah, I mean, contributing to this pretty insane statistic are a ton of factors. We're talking about debt load, family and intergenerational wealth, the slower rate in which Black homes even appreciate in value, and the institutional racism of the appraisal process that can find different appraisal values for a Black-owned home versus a white-owned home. It's a very troubling state of affairs, even if it's $8, $800, $8,000. All right, so it's been pretty heavy. It's time to get some feel-good news, right? Or at least let's talk about what's next, right? There are a lot of ideas and programs to pursue. We're going to talk about them on Wednesday. But remember, no silver bullet, no magic answer here. Responding to housing affordability must take place along a continuum of many different strategies. As I already said, we typically talk about affordable rental strategies. Here we're talking about affordable home ownership, but there are so many different sectors that you really have to look at together to address affordability crises. Okay. There's also the continuum of supply and demand, as we've talked about. We have to encourage more building and supply, but also address the demand side of things with direct grants and closing cost assistance and housing vouchers. And we also just have to appreciate that housing is situational. People move in and out of different housing situations, and different factors affect a household's ability to buy a home or pay their rent. These are all factors and situations that as policymakers, we have to anticipate and consider when creating housing policy. But let's remember, We also have legal obligations as policymakers. We have to do certain things. I think we're all pretty clear on disparate impact. We pretty much know that we can't create policies that have a discriminatory effect. You know, that took a long time for us to get here, but I think we know that, right? So we have an obligation not to discriminate, but we also have another obligation. There's an obligation not only to avoid discrimination, but to affirmatively further restorative policies. The Biden administration reinstated the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements of the Federal Housing Act. I'm sorry, of the Fair Housing Act. He reinstated them in 2021, and I'm happy to tell you that just last month in February 2023, there was a proposed rulemaking to bring some enforcement action behind the affirmatively furthering pieces of the Fair Housing Act. That's really good news. That's good movement from the federal government. Okay. But to be clear, as policymakers, anyone who takes money or acts on behalf of HUD or the federal government, we have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And that means doing our very best, showing that we're doing our very best to end residential segregation, eradicate discrimination, promote housing choice, address housing disparities, and access to opportunity. Sounds good, right? So that sounds great. How do we do that? All right, there are a lot of different ways, right? We talked about the continuum. You got to attack it from the top all the way down to the bottom, the supply, the demand across all the different sectors. There are a lot of ideas. Definitely more supply, definitely more supply. So there are a lot of ideas, and all of these ideas are terrific. They're great, and they're going to be beneficial to basically any home buyer, not just Black home buyers. But we've spent a lot of time already today talking about the tentacles of these historic policies. We understand that communities of color, particularly Black households, have effectively been forbidden from home ownership over the decades and been cut out of the wealth that would have occurred. Even more, Black households were limited to certain areas and neighborhoods that suffered long-term disinvestment, and they were limited to renting. And as I think a lot of you know, renting doesn't build equity. It doesn't even help your credit score. So research is increasingly showing us that to help heal these disparities, we need at least some policies that are intentionally race-based and intentionally race-conscious, that are protected class-based or protected class-conscious, okay? One more time, we need to take deliberate action to make deliberate policies to produce specific outcomes of equitable access, right? The intention is to have different impacts on different people because different households need different on-ramps to access. So examples include having different loan terms or having different credit score minimums for home buyers of color to counteract the impacts of decades of lost wealth and opportunity, okay? Perhaps lower interest rates for Black home buyers to ensure greater purchase power to compete against the all-cash bidding wars. Okay, higher amounts of down payment and closing cost assistance to counteract the denial of wealth over the years. We could incentivize sellers to sell to home buyers of color, or we could set up a program for BIPOC households to have special rates or access to 2- and 3-family homes so that they could build wealth and start to become engaged with their lender community. We could advocate for the broader use of special credit programs, right? Those give lenders the opportunity to have different loan terms for economically disadvantaged groups who hold the same characteristics like race or gender. Sure, all of that sounds really good, right? We're here, Rappaport Center for Law and Policy, okay? So I'd be remiss if I didn't close without talking about how law and policy interact, right? So even if we agree on all of these race-based programs and ideas, that's a really big if, okay? Even if we were to agree, the existing legal landscape doesn't allow it, all right? That same Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in residential lending against any person on the basis of race, colors, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin. So we can't have different programs and we can't have different loan terms for one particular class based on race. Then we have the big guy, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That one tells us No person in the US shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So any recipient of federal funds, and that's a lot of entities, okay? That's all the states, that's larger nonprofits, certain corporations, municipalities, and cities. Any recipient of federal funds has to refrain from using different policies for different races, ethnicities, and national origins. Yeah, it makes sense. So as a recipient of the federal funds, the Commonwealth and the cities within it and other actors are prevented from pursuing these protected class-based programs, even though that's the recommendation of scholars, data scientists, and even the policymakers themselves. To proceed with a race-based policy, a huge amount of evidence needs to be done and conducted. A narrow and time-limited policy needs to be created and tried. And all of that would need to be required just to see if we could pass the strict scrutiny review of the courts. So legislation is needed, advocacy is needed. It's a conundrum. But I'm happy, very happy to report that a lot of places are still pursuing these actions, even in spite of this legal landscape. Washington State recently, just at the end of last year, published what I think is a seminal report, laying the foundation for how government actors versus private actors, how government actors could address the racial homeownership gap through policies, and has filed state legislation attempting to develop a race-conscious lending program, below-market lending program. Governor Healy, she's elevated housing to the cabinet level, showing her support for tackling the housing crisis and the affordability issues. And Mayor Wu has committed a substantial amount of resources to affordable homeownership over the past year, with the hope of addressing the racial wealth gap. The lending industry, including state lenders like MHP, we're pursuing our own ideas too, many of which we'll talk about on Wednesday. But we must act. These conversations are different. They're different from when I joined MHP 4 years ago. They're very different from when I graduated law school. People are talking about this. People are talking about legislation. The Biden administration, again, as I said, affirmatively furthering fair housing just last month. That's shocking. It was repealed by the Trump administration just a few years ago. It's moving quickly, very quickly. But I think another way to look at this is just last year, even the Massachusetts Taxpayers Association agreed with this idea. They cited the enormous economic and fiscal benefits that would be received by all Massachusetts residents if the racial wealth gap was closed. Estimates are that the GDP for the country would have increased by $16 trillion if the gap was closed 20 years ago. In Massachusetts, the gross state product would increase by 25 billion over 5 years if we could close the racial gap in housing, wages, investment, and wealth. Remember, this is additional growth, additional revenue. This is not 16 trillion or 25 billion that is being taken from another place or another group or another community. Closing the racial wealth gap and building equitable access to homeownership isn't just the right thing to do. And it isn't just our legal responsibility to do as policymakers. It's good for everyone. It promotes growth, it promotes housing stability, promotes higher property values and wages. But also it's the right thing to do, okay? So what can all of you do? You can join me in the affordable housing industry. That's number one. Come and talk to me during office hours. Happy to talk about it. But really, starting today, start having conversations, gather people, talk to each other, talk to your friends, talk to your family, learn about your own housing story. We all have one, okay? Further advocacy and legislation will be needed to advance any kind of race-based or race-conscious homeownership policy. So we need to get the work started. We need to get it underway. We need it to gain traction, all right? You can start building awareness of these historic policies and the importance of undoing them. You can talk to folks about how undoing harmful policies is the first step toward building access for everyone, access and affordability for everyone. And that in order to heal the harm, we need specific interventions for specific people. Okay? You can also tell my light bulb story, but I'm hoping that you might want to start telling your own light bulb story. That's it. That's a lot, guys.
That's a lot. We have time for probably
A few questions.
We love having babies here.
Yes,
The
we
next
do.
Rappaport, newest member of our community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, could you talk about as we try to create policies that are prioritizing, affordability and possibly increased home ownership too? How do we also create guards to prevent or to try to minimize gentrification as well?
Yeah. So. I don't think it's turned on anyway. Those two things go hand in hand, of course, gentrification, displacement. These are critical issues as you think about homeownership. The areas that are being gentrified, those have high costs, and basically non-white families, as we've been talking about, can't access those areas anymore. So thinking about that, we talk about inclusionary zoning, we talk about ways that as you're building, perhaps as anyone is building, a developer or otherwise is building, once you get to a certain amount, we have to start reserving numbers of those units or numbers of the homes and condos being created for affordable homes or affordable residents who can pay a lower price. So that's one way of addressing gentrification. Other policies, like, again, that's on the supply side. You start to think about on the demand side. You can give funds to people who don't have intergenerational wealth, who don't have things so that they can compete in that market, so that they can stay in an area that's being gentrified. You can pass that law. Not right now, but you can. So it's pretty much that you're exactly right. As areas start to become more valuable, and as we all start to see that once different kinds of people start moving into a neighborhood and that changes and safety and security changes and different things change about a neighborhood just based on who lives there. Once you start seeing that, we have to understand how important it is to make sure that those who are there can stay if they want to. And that's an issue we'll talk about on Wednesday, but there are a lot of different angles to local preferences like that. And that's what we call it, a local preference for those who are local to the area, whether or not they can receive a preference of staying there.
Right. Well, one last quick question.
I'm Jill Rose from the Window. I'm also a mixed race. My mom was a Black single mother. We grew up in a lot of Section 8 housing. So along that lines, I kind of want to know what your opinion was on neighborhoods initiative. I think mentions about 3% is guaranteed to be giving housing for people with Section 8 vouchers. So if you kind of speak upon that and how you think developers, specifically in Boston, will receive that.
Yeah, so you're alluding to like the Section 8 to homeownership program, but also you're tapping on another issue, which is that a lot of our subsidy programs create what's called the cliff effect, right? And so that's the idea that as you save and as you start to have higher incomes, and your 30% of income starts growing, and all of these things that are great start happening. Now you're at a threat of losing your voucher, which might be the only way you can actually afford to stay in Boston so your kid can keep going to the same school, things like that. Okay, so there are programs, and this is another thing we could do. We could really put a lot of money into the Section 8 to homeownership program. There are programs that are set up to help mitigate that cliff effect, to bring a Section 8 voucher holder, talking to them about homeownership. As you're approaching that cliff, how to have your Section 8 payments go towards mortgage payments instead, to move into a homeownership model. And all of the things that I was talking about, credit scores, all of these would be other hurdles to overcome, but we can smooth those over. Section 8 to homeownership is really difficult, but it doesn't need to be. We could just, we need to revisit it. So it exists, and I think it's a great idea. I think as we can move people who want to move out of, wow. As we can move people who want to move out of some of our affordable housing units into homeownership, maybe they're ready, maybe that's what they want to do. You know, it's a great thing. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday, how to help support that transition and make it a successful transition, because it's good for everyone. Now you have a new homeowner, but now you also have a new affordable housing unit that's available to the portfolio. So these are really great things to work at and look at together.
So with that, I want to say, I hope that Danielle has whet everybody's appetite to come on Wednesday.
Oh,
Thank you for
yes.
this amazing.
Thanks so much, and thanks for bearing with our technical problems.
Yes, we're always sorry, Kat.
No problem.
I hope to see you Wednesday. Be policy.